In late November of 1942, Hermann Göring gave Adolf Hitler his word that the Air Force could feed an entire trapped army from the sky. He promised 300 tons of supplies a day. By the first week of February, the promise was a graveyard of aircraft, 488 transports lost, and the men they were sent to save were still starving in the snow. This is the story of the Stalingrad airbridge. It is the story of a transport fleet that flew itself to pieces, trying to keep a doomed army alive, and it ends with that fleet destroyed. Most tellings hang the failure on the weather. The weather was brutal, and it was real. What actually broke the fleet came in a single stretch of days, more than 150 miles behind the German front, at the hands of a Soviet tank officer whose name almost nobody remembers. Hold on to that distance. We will come back to the man who closed it. On the 19th of November, the Red Army launched Operation Uranus, and in 4 days the pincers met west of Stalingrad. Inside the ring sat the German Sixth Army, roughly 250,000 men, cut off from every road and rail line that fed them. Friedrich Paulus commanded them. He could break out west while the Soviet ring was still thin, or he could stay and be supplied from the air. Hitler chose the air. And the man who made that choice possible was Göring, who told the Führer his transports could carry the load. The load was the first lie. Paulus and his staff did the arithmetic. To keep the Sixth Army fighting at full strength took at least 500 tons of fuel and ammunition every single day, before a single loaf of bread. Some of his officers put the real figure closer to 750. The absolute floor, the amount needed just to keep men alive and rifles firing, was 300 tons a day. Göring seized on that floor and promised it, and never asked the men who would have to fly it. 2 of those men told him it could not be done. Wolfram von Richthofen commanded the 4th Air Fleet, the formation that would have to run the operation. He had no faith in it, and he said so plainly. In the filthy weather they had out there, he warned, there was not a hope of supplying an army of 250,000 men from the air. Under him, Lieutenant General Martin Fiebig ran the transport corps that would actually fly the sorties. When the Sixth Army's Chief of Staff, Arthur Schmidt, first raised the idea of air supply, Fiebig cut him off. Supplying a whole army by air, he warned, was impossible. Their own transport aircraft were already stretched thin, and many were tied down far away in North Africa. Both men were overruled, and both had been right. Count the fleet they had to build. There was no reserve of transport sitting idle for a job this size. The workhorse was the Junkers 52, a slow 3-engine machine that could carry about 2 tons at a crawl. The crews called it Auntie Jew. On the day the ring closed, the Air Force had only about 180 of them within reach of the job, and even the wider fleet of every type came to only around 500 aircraft. There were never enough. So the Air Force stripped them out of everywhere it could reach, and then it did something worse. The training schools were emptied too. Their instructor crews, the men who taught the next generation of pilots, flown into the pocket. The Heinkel 111, a medium bomber, was pressed into hauling fuel drums instead of bombs. Older Junkers, 86 trainers went in, and a handful of 4-engine Focke-Wulf 200s, and even the troubled new Heinkel 177. Schools and bomber wings had been stripped to build it, and this patchwork fleet was all the 250,000 men had left. Then the weather closed in, and it was every bit the enemy Richthofen had warned about. Fog sat on the airfields for days. Ice built on wings faster than crews could scrape it off. Temperatures fell far below zero, cold enough to freeze engine oil solid and split metal. A Junkers 52 would take off half blind and climb through freezing cloud. At the far end it had to find a snow-covered strip in a shrinking pocket while Soviet flak reached up and Soviet fighters waited above the approach. Some days almost nothing flew. On the very first day of the airlift, the Soviet fighters and flak brought down 22 transports, and 9 more went down the day after. On the days it did fly, the fleet lost aircraft in numbers no air force could stand for long. So the tonnage never came close. Across the whole operation, the 6th Army received an average of about 118 tons a day, against the 300 that Göring had sworn was the minimum. Through December, the average sank to roughly 70 tons. In the worst stretches, the men on the ground got 90 tons or less, or on the fog-bound days, nothing at all. The full 300 tons was reached only about a dozen times in more than 2 months. On its single best day, the 7th of December, the fleet pushed just over 360 tons onto the airfields inside the ring. It never came close to that figure again. Every ton that failed to arrive was measured out in bread. Paulus cut the bread ration to under 3 ounces a day. 1 loaf was split between 7 men. Move inside the ring, because that is where the arithmetic turned into hunger. The main airfield of the pocket was Potomnik, out on the frozen steppe west of the city. It was the one thread that connected the 6th Army to the outside world. Sick and wounded men were dragged and half carried toward it from every corner of the front, because a seat on an outbound transport was the only way out of that place. Aircraft came in low through the flak, dumped fuel drums and ammunition crates onto the snow, loaded whatever wounded they could carry, and clawed back into the air. The scenes around the loading ramps grew desperate as the ration shrank and the cold deepened. Inside the ring, the army had already eaten its horses down to nothing, and men hunted rats through the frozen ruins. By the end, most of the survivors were suffering from open starvation. Listen to the men in the trenches around it. On the 15th of January, a company commander named Kurt Mandelhelm, who led a battalion in the 295th Infantry Division, set down what his unit had left. In just the last 2 days, he wrote with his adjutant Karl Gottschalk, the battalion had lost 60 men to casualties and frostbite. More than 30 others had walked off. There was ammunition enough to last until evening, and no more. The soldiers have not eaten in 3 days, he wrote, and many have frostbitten feet. That same day, across the pocket, thousands of frightened men wrote what they knew were their last letters home. They handed them to the last outbound flights. Most of the writers never left. There was one chance to lift the siege from the outside, and it came agonizingly close. In the middle of December, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein sent a panzer force under Hermann Hoth driving north to punch a corridor through to the pocket. The tanks reached to within about 30 miles of the ring. Men inside the 6th Army could see the flares of the relief force flickering on the southern horizon. Then the Red Army opened a fresh offensive against a thin flank to the northwest, the drive called Little Saturn. The danger it created forced Hoth to break off and pull his tanks back. The corridor never opened, and one spearhead of that same offensive was already racing for a target worth more than any corridor. The transports did not appear over Potomnik out of nowhere. They flew from bases far to the west, and the most important of those bases was a field near the town of Tatsinskaya, more than 150 miles behind the German front. It was the main departure airfield for the Junkers 52s, feeding the pocket, packed with parked aircraft and stores of fuel. While the Sixth Army starved to the east, the Red Army sent a spearhead straight at that field. The man who led it was Major General Vasily Badanov, commanding the 24th Tank Corps. He set out on the 24th of December with 159 tanks, driving deep into the German rear at the very tip of that offensive. His corps covered the ground fast and outran its own supply lines. Burst onto the Tatsinskaya airfield while the field was still crowded with transports. Soviet tanks rolled straight down the flight lines. Crews rammed the tails of parked aircraft to wreck them and shot up others still lashed to the railway cars that had delivered them. When the field fell, German records counted around 72 transport aircraft destroyed on the ground. That was close to a tenth of the entire transport capacity assigned to the operation. Gone in a matter of hours, a heavier blow than any single day of weather had ever landed. Badanov had struck the fleet where it lived. Now German panzer divisions raced to seal off the field, and by the 27th of December the 24th Tank Corps was surrounded, deep inside enemy ground, out of fuel and nearly out of ammunition. Badanov radioed in the clear for help that could not reach him. Soviet aircraft flew in what little they could, dropping a few hundred artillery shells and rifle rounds into the pocket he now held. Stalin, seeing the propaganda value of the captured field, at first refused to give it up. Permission to break out came only on the 28th. The Corps fought its way clear at a terrible price. Of the men who had ridden out on the offensive, only 927 came back. About 1 in 10. Badanov's shattered corps was made a guards formation for what it had done. He himself became the first man to receive one of the Soviet Union's new commander's decorations. He had traded a tank corps for the throat of the airbridge. It was a trade the Germans could not match. After Tatsinskaya, the airlift never recovered its footing, and the pocket began to fall in on itself. In the middle of January, the Red Army closed on Potomnik. From the 15th, the field lay under artillery fire, and within 2 days, it was overrun. Its loss tore out the heart of the operation. The wounded who had gathered there now had to struggle east to a rougher, smaller strip at Gumrak, and many did not survive the walk. That same week, with the pocket already coming apart, Hitler reached for Erhard Milch, the hard-driving deputy who ran German aircraft production. He handed Milch sweeping authority to force the airlift back to life. Milch threw everything he had at it. He commandeered aircraft and pushed trainloads of supplies up to the departure fields, overriding any commander who slowed him down. It changed nothing that mattered. He had come to a system already breaking, its main airfield inside the ring about to fall, its transport scattered and worn out, and no reserve of tonnage anywhere to be found. What the airlift had needed was more aircraft in November. By the time Milch arrived, those aircraft were the wreckage he had been sent to account for. Gumrak held for only a few more days. It was the last field the 6th Army controlled, and it too came under fire and then under Soviet guns. On the 22nd of January, a single Heinkel 111 lifted off from Gumrak carrying 19 wounded men, and it was the last flight to leave the encircled army. The next day, the field fell. After that, supplies could only be dropped by parachute onto positions that were caving in, and much of what fell drifted into Soviet hands. The men inside were beyond the reach of any aircraft. On the 2nd of February, the last of the 6th Army in Stalingrad laid down its arms. When Milch's staff finally added up what the airbridge had cost, the number came to 488 transport aircraft. 274 were destroyed outright or simply vanished into the weather and the flak. Another 214 came home so badly damaged they had to be written off. The worst of it fell on the Junkers 52, the fleet's backbone, with 266 of them gone. That one figure was more than a third of every transport of that type the entire Air Force owned. The bombers pressed into the work paid as well, with 165 Heinkel 111s lost, along with dozens of the older trainers and the handful of 4-engine machines that had been thrown in. The aircraft were only part of the loss, and not the part that hurt longest. More than 1,000 aircrew were lost flying into and out of the pocket. Many of them were the instructors pulled from the flight schools, the very men whose job was to train the pilots of the coming years. The Air Force had burned its own seed corn over Stalingrad. It flew more than 6,000 sorties into the ring and never once delivered what had been promised. It came out the other side with its transport arm gutted for the rest of the war, and that strength never came back. Weigh the two ledgers against each other. On one side stood an air force that promised 300 tons a day and delivered barely a third of it. It lost 488 aircraft and more than 1,000 trained men, and the army it swore to save went under anyway. On the other side stood a single Soviet tank corps. It spent itself down to 927 survivors to reach one airfield in the German rear, and by reaching it, helped make the failure certain. Göring had promised a bridge of aircraft strong enough to carry an army. What he built instead was the destruction of his own transport fleet. And the man who cut that bridge in half was a tank officer named Badanov, whose name never made it into the story most people were told.